for sharing your time and for accommodating in your very demanding schedule this opportunity to speak with the faculty and the students of Columbia, of the School of International and Public Affairs. Just a small introduction of Mrs. van der Hoeven. She has a brilliant career in politics. She was first Minister of Education, then the Minister of Economy, and it was in that position that we first met. We were just saying that there was a moment where in the European Council of Ministers we were the most senior people because we stayed there for so long. Everybody was rotating and we were always there. She was very kind to visit Portugal in July 2007. We had a fantastic lunch with our families. And there's a huge interest about energy at SIPA and Columbia. Several very serious classes. The students are extremely serious and very high quality. They read everything about the agency. In my classes, we are already discussing chapters of the 2012 report. And tomorrow there will be a special lecture on energy efficiency. And so, without further ado, Maria, thank you very much for being with us. And I hope that this is the first of many times, okay?
Thank you very much, dear Professor Pinho, dear Manuel, for the invitation and also for referring to the classes and that your classes already use World Energy Outlook. But of course, there's always one special book for you. So that we start by handing World Energy Outlook 2012 to you. And thank you very much for inviting me here today.
Thank you very much.
And now, dear friends, let's have a look at what World Energy Outlook 2012 brings us and tells us. You know, over the past 12 months, we have seen some shifts, some major shifts in the global energy landscape, and the signs are quite different from each other. There was the continued resurgence in oil and gas production in some countries, here in the United States most notably, but also in Iraq, in some other OPEC countries. There was also a retreat from nuclear power, notably in Japan, although it's still under discussion, in Germany, Switzerland, possibly even France, and the discussions there were, of course, because of Fukushima and what happened afterwards. And there was also the announcement of some new policies that have raised hopes for renewed improvements in energy efficiency. But at the same time, we've seen something else. We've seen extremely high prices of oil and of gas. And oil, they have quite some consequences, because if you have oil prices that are high, at a high level for a long time, for instance, they will reach for 5% of your GDP, well, then it can really hamper your economic development. And as far as gas prices go, a couple of years ago, gas prices all over the world were around the same price. But at this moment, we see gas prices in the United States from $2 to $3 per MBTU. We can see gas prices in Europe differing from $10 to $12 per MBTU. And when we go to Asia, it's even more. It's $16 to $18 per MBTU. And I'll come back to that later in my presentation. And we have seen some really persistent symptoms of a really unsustainable energy system. Let me mention just three. You know, the cost of fossil fuel subsidies, that are fossil fuel subsidies, the ones that we estimate they are the fossil fuel subsidies on consumption. So there are subsidies that really incentivize wasteful consumption. They have jumped up. They have jumped up by almost 30% in 2011. And at this moment, we are talking about $523 billion in 2011. And where did it come from? It was driven by subsidies in the Middle East, post-Arab Spring. The second thing was that we have carbon dioxide emissions rising higher and higher. In 2011, 1 gigaton higher than they were in 2010. And at the same time, we see climate change issues slip down the policy agenda. And yes, we have seen some new commitments in this year, this United Nations Year of Sustainable Energy for All. But nevertheless, 1.3 billion of people all around the world, so that means 20% of the poorest people, because these are the ones we are talking about, are without access to electricity. And this is still the case, and you can imagine what that means for social and economic developments. So this is the framework, and this is the context. This is the starting point for our 2012 projections of global energy developments to 2035. And well, altogether, it won't come as a surprise to you that the world is still failing to put the global energy system onto a more sustainable path. Now, we always had our new policy scenarios. That was the central one. And in that scenario, we take into account all announced policy plans, commitments, even when not yet formally adopted or implemented. And in that central new policy scenario, we can see global demand for energy to rise, to continue to rise, and will increase by more than 1/3 over the period to 2035. And you can see from this slide what it means. In, for instance, the first slide, the first part, in 1975, 2/3 of energy used in the world was consumed by countries of the OECD. But in 2010, it's 45, and in 2035 it will go down to 1/3. Does this mean that the OECD countries are using less energy? No, they are not. But it means that the rest of the world, especially China, India, and the Middle East, and other non-OECD countries, there is the growth in energy demand. And the largest share of this increase, it's 60%, comes from China, India, and the countries of the Middle East. And this means something. That means that the center of gravity moves eastwards. And I'll come back to that later because there are some other examples that I can show, that I can tell about. Now, what we also can see that is that demand for oil will grow, and we expect it to rise to close to 100 million barrels a day in 2035, and today it's 89 million barrels a day. We can see demand for coal rising by 21%, and natural gas by a remarkable 50%. And then, of course, you might say, is there nothing to say about renewables? Oh yes, renewables continue to grow rapidly, especially in the power sector. And their share of generation will increase from around 20% today to 31% in 2035. So all these trends that I'm talking about have, of course, direct implications for climate change and for emissions and for the global temperature increase. And what we expect in our central scenario, that we are on the wrong track. We are on a track towards a global temperature increase of at least 3.6% and even more. So that's the track we are on. Now, let's have a look again at the global picture. Now, one of the changes taking place today, I would call it game changer number one, is this resurgence of oil and gas production in the United States. There was a combination of technologies. They were used, the fracking, it was there, hydraulic fracking, it was there, everything that had to do with unconventional resources. And these new technologies, well, before they were considered to be difficult, or they were too expensive to use. But things changes because of the high prices. And what we have seen, that conventional oil and gas output has long been in decline in the United States, and it will change. The United States is set to become the largest global producer of oil and gas by 2020, before 2020. Well, this was something that was, well, all but unthinkable a few years ago. But it's, of course, producing. When we are talking about exporting oil and gas, that will still be Saudi Arabia. But producing, the largest producer of oil and gas before 2020, it will be in the United States. And of course, the effects of this unconventional revolution are felt well beyond the United States. Let me just give you one example. Because of the very cheap gas prices, the low gas prices in the United States, the coal prices were higher. So what we could see in the United States, that gas pushed coal out of the market in power generation. And then the question, of course, is what is coal going to do? Well, coal looks for a different market. And what we can see now, that is coal traveling all over the Atlantic to Europe. And there we can see the different thing. Not gas pushing coal out of the market, but coal pushing gas out of the market. What does it mean for CO2 emissions? Well, in the United States, it's wonderful. CO2 emissions went down, but not in Europe, they went up. So what's the global effect? None. And I think this is something that we always have to bear in mind. There is no energy island. And everything that happens on a large scale, for instance, in the United States, has its effects everywhere. Then there are also some people who tell me, well, if there is a kind of energy independence in the United States, wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, I can tell you one thing. A real energy independence won't be there. Because even in 2035, a quarter of the oil needs in the United States will be imported, but not imported anymore from the Middle East. I'll come back to that. And you know all about that. Oil markets are global, so that means that the price-setting mechanisms are global. And that means that the price and the availability of oil are really very tight with global events and with oil availability elsewhere. And I think that's what we have to bear in mind as well. So increasing oil and gas production, yes, they are good things, also for global energy security. They're perfect for American competitiveness, but let's not forget how interconnected we really are. Now let's have a look at game changer number 2. And that's the oil production growth in Iraq. What we found there, and what we knew, of course, that is that the known resources are immense. And yes, the country is one of the least explored in the world, that's true. But the costs of production are among the lowest in the world. Just 2 examples. 15 times cheaper than Canadian oil sands. 7 to 10 times cheaper than Russia. So this is enormous. So we have done a study, a survey, and we worked together with the government in Iraq. It was the first time that IEA, well, it's an organization of 28 countries, non-OPEC countries, of course, because we are the consuming countries. It's the first time that we were asked to do something like this in an OPEC country. It was the Iraq government that approached us and asked us, well, can't you do a survey on our energy situation and see what we could do to improve our situation? Well, that's what we did. Well, our projections anticipate a doubling of Iraq's production to reach 6 million barrels a day in 2020, and then a further increase to 8 million barrels a day in 2035. And you can see from this picture that most comes from the supergiant fields in the south. But don't forget about the northern Kurdistan region. They also hold very significant potential and already have become one of the most actively explored regions in the world. You know, this outlook is lower than the official outlook of the Iraqi government. But we think this is more plausible, and it has to do with the fact that there are, well, quite some potential constraints facing Iraq, and I'll mention just a few of them. The political consensus on governance of the oil and gas sector between the federal government and the Kurdistan region. There is the need for new transportation, storage, export infrastructure. You need sufficient water to support production. You need electricity development. And there's the need for Iraq to develop its own expertise, its own HR and institutions after all these years of conflict. But where will all these barrels go to? Well, currently, Iraq's export is split 50-50 between Asian markets and the rest of the world. And in the future, we think this split will be overwhelmingly in favor of Asia. Again, moving east. And there's something else I would like to mention. There is an axis between Baghdad and Beijing. Beijing, China, Chinese companies investing in Iraq. They started already doing that, buying property there and investing there. And they do it just for one reason: money, expertise from Beijing to Baghdad And you can expect oil and later on gas from Iraq into the east. And I think this is important to realize that what is happening there. Now, let's have a look at Middle East and at oil markets. In our opinion, the main factor driving demand in the oil markets and in the decades to come will be growth. Not growth in OECD countries, but growth in emerging countries. And it will particularly growth for transport in China, India, and also the countries of the Middle East. And this increase in demand, in oil demand in emerging countries, more than outweighs reductions in demand that we anticipate in OECD countries. And this is exactly the main reason that keeps our anticipated oil price around today's levels. And the assumed oil price in 2035, we think will remain high at $125 per barrel in today's real terms. But this shift in the source of global oil demand towards emerging countries, towards emerging economies in Asia, together with this expected increase in production from the United States, will produce a reorientation of global oil flows over the coming decades. And yes, for the Middle East, it will remain the largest source of global exports. 90% of its exports is expected to head eastwards to markets in Asia, China, India, Japan and Korea. And China will overtake the United States to become by far the largest global importer of oil. Now you see this thin slice there at the United States. But please don't forget, this is only Middle East exports to the United States. And as I mentioned before, even in 2035, we expect 25% of oil needs in the United States has to be imported. But it will be imported from countries that are more nearby, like Canada or Latin America. Now, some of the same dynamics are in play with natural gas. And at this moment, we have a number of big gas markets. We can see here the major global gas trade flows in 2010. We can see that the main international gas trade flows are those supplying Europe and delivering gas to Korea, to Japan. And you can see North America almost completely detached from global trade. But in 2035, this picture will become much more diverse, and the focus of international trade again switches towards Asian markets because they are expected to grow rapidly. But we also see that North and South America will emerge as important exporting countries, exporting regions, as do Australia and Africa. Now, in this whole story, there are two things I would like to mention. One is the continued rise of unconventional gas, and this really plays a very important role in this picture because it accounts for nearly half of the growth in global gas production. But the first growth, and foremost more, is here in North America. But it will spread worldwide. It will spread to Australia, because they are investing already there in shale gas exploration, and it will also spread to other countries, including China. But the second thing I would like to remark has to do with pricing mechanism. At this moment, we have three major regional markets. As I mentioned, the Americas with low gas prices, Europe, high gas prices, Asia Pacific, very high gas prices. And the reason is because they all have their own price setting mechanisms, where in the European market, it's a combination of long-term contracts based on oil indexation, and we have the spot markets. In the East Asian markets, we only have the price-setting mechanism of the oil indexed to the oil-linked pricing. So what we expect is when conventional gas grows, the terms of international gas trade evolve, they will become more flexible, and we anticipate this altogether will put pressure on conventional gas suppliers and on traditional oil-linked pricing mechanisms for gas. And that would mean that in the eastern part of the world, the gas prices will be lower and will be more, well, how shall I put it, will look more like the European ones. At least that's what they hope, and I think that's what is going to happen, especially at the moment that they are going to develop their own spot markets, for instance, in Singapore, and China will develop one in Shanghai. Now let's have a look at what this means when we bring everything together. There is a spread of unconventional oil and gas production, yes, but all the major importing countries and regions will become dependent, more dependent on oil and gas imports over the period to 2035. Well, Japan and Korea, there will happen not really something because they are almost entirely dependent on imported oil and gas. So when you are already there at 100%, well, then it's 100%. You can't be more dependent than 100%. But the EU, China and India, by 2035, they all depend on imports for more than 80% of their oil consumption. And they will see gas import dependence increase. Now let's have a look at the United States. There we see that the share of imports in US oil consumption is halved, and the country becomes a small but significant exporter of gas. And why is the share of imports in US oil consumption halved? There are two reasons for that. One is the growth in production. That's true. At this moment in North Dakota, they are producing around 600,000 barrels a day. But the other reason is fuel efficiency standards. And what we can see that this means that domestic consumption will go down. And these two things together have an effect, and that's the effect that is shown here in this picture. So whereas North Dakota sees to it that there is more oil on the domestic market, it will be Detroit that will have to see after the fuel efficiency standards. But altogether the effect will be like this. I would like to go to electricity with you now. And there again, the overall picture is how these emerging economies drive a 60% in the demand for power. But let's not forget about coal. I mentioned it just once, but over the coming decades, coal will remain the leading global fuel for power generation. Yes, it will be caught up by renewables, which will become the world's second largest source of power generation already in 2015. But coal will be the leading global fuel for power generation. That's the global picture. But of course, there are always variations. Well, let's have a look at Japan. In Japan, we can see that there was this decline in nuclear output. Well, then you have to compensate it by something. It's compensated by electricity from renewables. It's compensated by a higher reliance on LNG imports and strong improvements in efficiency. In Europe, it's different. There we can see that wind and solar push the share of renewables up over 2/5 of generation. And in the United States, yes, there will also be this increase, but also change in power generation, where coal continues to struggle against cheap natural gas and subsidized renewables. Although, I have to be honest about subsidized renewables. I do not know what your next administration is going to decide on that. And we all know that by the end of this year, there will be an end to a number of subsidized renewable schemes. And what will be next? Well, let's wait and see. So we can't say anything about that. Let's have a look at India. India will see a strong economic and growth population and also a large increase in total generation by 2035. But spread, as you can see from this, across a diverse set of fuels. But even if this happens in India, even then the electricity consumption per capita in India in 2035 will be equal to the electricity consumption per capita in the United States in 1947. So there's a 100 years gap in the use of electricity in between the United States and India. So although this is a nice figure, let's not forget about reality, because that's also telling. Another thing that's very telling is, of course, China. The growth in China's electricity demand over the period to 2035 is greater than the total current electricity demand in the United States and Japan together. And that's, of course, a very remarkable figure. And you can understand that whenever they choose something in Beijing, that it will have its effects everywhere in the world. Let me give you two examples. If China would really choose to make serious efforts in CCS technology, given their amount, the amount of coal they are using. You can imagine that would mean something, because then this technology would be deployed further and the cost would come down. The same goes for renewables. Now they decided a couple of years ago to manufacture solar panels. If they would decide to manufacture solar panels that are best available technology, you can imagine that it would be a push for renewables. So decisions being made in Beijing, but also in Delhi, they will affect all of us. Now, back to renewables. There was a period of strong growth in many countries, but we can see now that some governments, well, that renewables have reached a crossroads, and I'll tell you why. Of course, all governments look at the undoubted benefits. That's true. But they also review critically how renewables are being supported and how much that is costing. Now, in 2011, renewables received subsidy, and it was altogether 88 billion US dollars all over the world altogether. 64 for electricity, 24 for biofuels, but just 88 billion US dollars subsidies for renewables. You remember I mentioned the amount of subsidies fossil fuels, 523 billion US dollars. So what if would happen if the world really decided to phase out the fossil fuels on consumption and use that money for renewables, for subsidy on renewables? It's a political decision, but our figures shows that the money is there, but you have to decide how are you going to use it. Now, let's have a look at what we think what is happening. The existing subsidized electricity generation capacity has locked in almost 1 trillion US dollars of subsidies. It's promised money. It was arranged money. So the money is already there, and some of these plants will continue to receive payments until after 2030. But another thing we expect is 2.6 trillion of subsidies for renewables-based electricity, and that is paid for capacity that we expect to be built in the coming years. And you can imagine there will be commitments extending beyond the time horizon of the outlook. And then there are the biofuels. The biofuels, they will receive more subsidies in each successive year, and altogether it will be 4 trillion in renewable subsidies over the outlook that we think will be needed to meet the 2020 targets, or in other words, to meet these 2 degrees Celsius increase of the global temperature. Is the money there? Yes, we think the money is there. But the question is, how are we going to decide? What are we going to decide? And we is, of course, not the IEA, it's the governments. Now, the prices in electricity, I would also like to say something about, because there are considerable prices in electricity between the regions. We have talked already of the differences in gas prices, but we can also see the differences in electricity prices. And the highest prices, European Union and Japan, and they are well above those in the United States and in China. And the reasons for that is that the costs in the fuel costs in the United States and China are lower, and that is because in Europe and Japan they have to import natural gas, for instance. There is the carbon pricing in European Union. There are the renewable subsidy costs that are passed to consumers through the electricity prices, and there are the higher capital costs for building new capacity. What we expect is that the electricity prices are to increase in real terms over the coming decades, and we expect 15% on average, and I mentioned the reasons that are behind that. Well, 15% increase in price. That even then, it means that China and the United States will really have a competitive advantage. And you can imagine what that means for your industrial competitiveness, for your heavy industry. And you understand what it means for your purchasing power of citizens. There is one issue that we actually have not talked about before in the WEO, and that's water. This is the first time that we cover water for energy. Because, you know, water and energy, they have a relation. Energy depends on water. For instance, in the power generation, for the extraction, transport and processing of fossil fuels. We need it for the irrigation of biofuels feedstock crops. And it's vulnerable. Water is vulnerable because there are physical constraints on its availability. Now, this is important. And at this moment, we estimate that the energy sector currently accounts for some 15% of the world's total water use. And 15% is 580 billion cubic meters per year. We expect that to rise. We expect it to rise by 1/5. So that means that we need 20% of water use will be used by energy. And this is huge. And it shows that water availability will increasingly impact energy sector reliability and costs, especially when you couple it with this more water-constrained future as population and the global economy grow and climate change looms. Yes, I know such vulnerabilities are manageable in most cases, but they require something. In the first place, they require an awareness that you need water to produce energy. And it will require the deployment of better technology, and also when you have water and energy policies that you integrate them more than it has been done up till now. Now, in every year, we also focus on a fuel. And this year, we chose energy efficiency as a fuel. And that's a possible game changer number 3. And we consider it a fuel, although it's hidden. You can't put it into your tank, you can't feel it, you can't lift it. We consider it as a fuel because improving energy efficiency can help to satisfy rising demand in the very same way as increasing energy production. And this is something we have to realize. And the potential is there, but some way or the other we just don't make use of that potential. And yes, different countries have done different bits, and they are right on energy efficiency. Australia implemented effective industrial energy efficiency policies. India did. The US has its tight standards for cars. Japan has a top runner program in advancing efficiency of many technologies, including appliances. Even China is targeting a 16% reduction in energy intensity by 2015. I mentioned already the United States with its new fuel economy standards. So there are a number of things that already have been done or are in the course of being done. But even if we assume that these countries make progress to meeting these targets and other policies are implemented elsewhere, the world would still leave unused 2/3 of the economic potential of energy efficiency. And this is not technical potential, because the technical potential is much more bigger than this. It's economic potential. There's one bright thing in this picture, and that's the industry. Industry with its 45%. And I think there is a reason behind that. The reason is that industry is about making money. To make money is their objective, not to burn money. So if you use the fuel that you need more efficient, so use less, then it affects your costs. And that's exactly what industry is doing at this moment. So we thought, well, what can we do with energy efficiency? Isn't there anything we can do about it that will link a couple of objectives together? And then we decided to present an efficient world scenario. And the efficient world scenario is based on the idea that energy efficiency measures that make economic sense, because that's what we're talking about, are widely adopted. Now, in this scenario, the global primary energy demand growth is cut by half compared to our new policy scenario. Well, let's put it in a different way. By tapping the economic potential of energy efficiency, we can achieve energy savings in 2035, equivalent to nearly 1/5 of global demand in 2010. And it really is telling where these efficiency savings are: in coal, in oil, in gas, in others. So if you don't use this amount of fuel between 2000 and 2035, if you have this gap, you can do something about it. And then the question of what does this mean? Well, the savings in terms of oil, as I mentioned before, in our new policy scenario, the oil demand reaches almost 100 million barrels a day in 2035. Well, in the efficient world scenario, oil will peak at 91 million barrels a day before 2020 and then decline to 2035. And then there are savings. And the savings are around 13 million barrels a day, around. Well, what does it tell us? Well, 13 million barrels a day, they are equivalent to the current production of Russia and Norway combined. They are equivalent, they are more than Saudi Arabia. And when we talk about money, it's more than $500 billion per year at today's oil prices. So it makes sense. It makes economic sense. And these efficiencies, do they mean that the quality of our life is to be diminished? No. Does it mean that our economy would be worse off? No. It is about doing more with less, doing things better. So actually, we think that the world needs to wake up to energy efficiency as soon as possible and in a much bigger way than it is now. And yes, this efficient world scenario, it will cost money, that's true. You need some additional investments to improve energy efficiency, that is true. But it's more than offset by savings in fuel expenditures in households and firms. And we expect globally that expenditure on energy in the efficient world scenario is cut by 20% in 2035 with the new policy scenario. And you can see what it means, especially in countries like China and India, where the biggest growth in demand will be. But this also means that the world economy reorients itself towards producing more energy efficient goods and services. And this frees up resources, money, that can then be put to productive use elsewhere. And yes, energy efficiency brings climate benefits. Governments say they want us to limit, and the governments want to limit the average global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. Well, that's nice. But as I mentioned before, we are not on the right track. Our current track is to 3.60 degrees Celsius increase or more. We expect even more. So the pace of international efforts toward this goal of 2 degrees Celsius, it's frustrating. And, well, economic concerns have come to the fore. Yes, it's understandable, but it is regrettable that other policy issues fall down the priority list. Now, the analysis we had in last year's World Energy Outlook, and they are in our central scenario, they show us that current energy infrastructure, that's power plants, cars, factory, etc., already locked in over 80% of the CO2 emissions allowable to 2035, if we really want to have an increase in average global temperature to 2 degrees Celsius. So there's very little room to maneuver. And without further action, so just going on the same trend as we are on now, by 2017, we would reach a situation where the energy infrastructure then in place would eat up all the emissions that are permitted under this 2-degree scenario through to 2035. So what about the 2-degree scenario? Well, let's forget about it. It's impossible. So because we do not see a legal global binding agreement, for instance. What about CCS? What about this discussion on nuclear? What about concentrated solar power? What about the decrease, for instance, here in the United States in subsidy for renewables? So these trends do not help. So what can energy efficiency do? Can energy efficiency be of help? Yes, we think it can. Because if you implement these measures that we described in that scenario, it would push back this date 5 years to 2022. And I tell you why, because the need to build new energy infrastructure is delayed because of the greater energy efficiency of energy use. So there is an additional 5-year window, and that could be useful to really secure this much-needed global agreement to cut greenhouse gas emissions. But, dear friends, this is not a given fact. It's not reality now. It is a scenario, and the scenario is based on a number of assumptions. And the most important assumption is that we get into action now on energy efficiency. So if you don't do it, no 2022. Yes, 2022, but not with this result. And that's, of course, always the challenge of using something like World Energy Outlook or other scenarios, they are scenarios. And if the assumptions change or the moment reality changes, then the outcome changes as well. And this is something we have to bear in mind. Now, in this World Energy Outlook, we have really a tough set of challenges for global policymakers. They are facing difficult choices, that's true. Sometimes these choices are even contradictory because you have to meet energy security, economic and environmental objectives. And there are these interactions between between fuels and markets. And these interactions are becoming more intense where energy developments in one part of the world really are felt quickly across the globe. And there's something else. I don't know how it's in your countries because you're coming all from different countries, but what we can see is that public acceptance of energy projects is really becoming much more difficult to obtain. I'm coming from the Netherlands, and we have huge problems in getting licenses to permits to build wind farms, whether they are onshore or offshore or wherever they are. There are problems in getting the permits, the public acceptance for grid extensions. And so there are many other things that we can see as a problem. Then there is the increasing thirst for water. We see changing patterns of energy production and use. And all these things could really have far-reaching implications for global economic and geopolitical balances. Well, at the same time, it looks as if the defining challenge of our times to address climate change has all but disappeared from the high-level political agenda. So all these things together, have a look at energy efficiency, because it's really helpful. You know, it increases energy security, it tackles environmental issues, it improves economic prospects. That's what it brings to you. But of course, it's just an option. And it's up to our policy and decision makers to choose if they want to use that option. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. Some years ago, energy was a dull issue.
Yeah.
Now, regarding energy, there is never a dull moment. There are a lot of exciting issues. We cannot be intellectually lazy. It's not a complicated issue, energy, but we cannot afford to be intellectually lazy. And in my view, the World Energy Outlook 2012 brings a lot of new issues. We see your fingerprint already. And if I may say, some aspects are very important in my view. Linkages. This is an issue that really needs to be developed in the future, but for example, the meaning of US energy independence. What does it matter? There is one single price for oil in the world, so the US will import less oil, but by no way it will be independent, because what matters for consumers is the price of oil. Another very interesting issue pointed out in this report is the shift eastward of energy trade, and that will be for good. 90% of the increase in energy demand over the next 25 years will come from China, India, and other countries. The figures you mentioned about subsidies, they are so important. When people criticize renewable energies, $8 billion compared with $800 billion for subsidies for fossil fuels. I was responsible for a very ambitious renewable energy program, and sometimes it was criticized for being too expensive. Now, when you compare to the fact that when you want to build a nuclear power plant, you need the 100% state guarantee. I mean, if solar and wind would need government guarantees of this amount, I mean, everybody would criticize. Now, Iraq, so important, and so many question marks regarding development in Iraq and the role of China in Iraq. Now, the greatest tribute we can pay to the IEA is that in my class, it's mandatory reading the Golden Age of Gas report, Electricity to the Poor, Russia. We even had a special class on Rosneft that just emerged as the #1 oil company. in the world. And we anticipated water because we also had a session on water. About water, there are so many question marks. Trevor, would you like to raise the first question, please?
I would. Thank you, Manuel. I guess one of the things that I find concerning about any of the scenarios is I can't get over the cognitive dissonance in my head between the growth in energy demand, offset by the efficiencies and improvements along the way, even some very aggressive ones that I think will happen, and the implications of then the price that in the report, which is talking about oil prices, if I remember correctly, and I'm sorry, $125, $140 on a real basis, so significant increases from today, and the economic growth characteristics that were required to get to the energy volume demand growth. Mm-hmm. So I have a lot of I can't see those two things happening simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if, because, and perhaps it's the experience of every time global oil prices or global energy prices on an aggregate BTU basis weighted across the amount of fuels that we use has gotten to these levels, we've seen substantial economic activity diminishment. So, and it's happened in the 70s, it's happened in the last 5 years. How do we reconcile that we can both grow and demand a lot more energy at higher prices and absorb that without undermining our economic capability to grow? I can't get those two things to work in my head.
I can understand. I would like to approach my answer I would like to start my answer from the angle of the energy efficiency, because the point is, if you have if you have an incentive that encourages wasteful consumption, because the price you pay does not cover the cost, and that's what happens, well, then there is a problem. Because why should you be efficient in your house? Well, of course, your car is more efficient than the one you had before. Well, that gives you an opportunity to buy another car. Then you have two cars. So it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I think it's important that together with energy efficiency, bringing more efficient items to the market, that you have a pricing mechanism as well. And people are not really interested in the price per unit. They're interested in what is down at the bill. What's the total amount they have to pay? That's what they're interested in. And I think that what they did in California, for instance, where the important thing is that you have a pricing mechanism linked to energy efficiency so that your bill is flat. Yes, the price per unit is higher, but because you need less units, the price of your bill is flat. So I think that pricing, that energy efficiency measures can only work if they are linked with the best pricing policy. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And if you do it in that way, then it also works for industry, because then there is an incentive to bring the costs down, to be efficient. And if the incentive is not there, then it won't happen. And I think this is really very, very important. And then, of course, there are the prices of global oil. That's one thing. But that does not need to reflect the price that you pay as in total when you pay your bill. And that's where energy efficiency again comes in. So that's why we think it is an option to reduce your import bills, because you need less. You disencourage wasteful consumption. And at the same time, it brings also economic benefits, because it becomes interesting to have research and development in new appliances, in new fuel standards. And for instance, now the United States is doing a couple of things in cars. But even then, the cars produced in the United States are less efficient than the cars coming from other countries. And can you imagine what happens if there is real fuel efficiency in trucks? What that will mean. Mm-hmm. And the most important thing for people is that what they pay at the pump is not too much. And it's not the price per unit. It's what you pay at the end. So that's where efficiency can give an answer, and that's why it's economically viable. I hope I'm clear about it. Of course, there's something else I would like to say on the subsidies. We only looked into the consumption subsidies, but of course there are also the subsidies on production. And this is not something we are doing. This is something the OECD is doing. And I think it's important that we look into that as well, So the fossil fuel production subsidies, and for instance, what we can see in Germany, they are phasing out the subsidies on coal production, on the coal mines. So this is their contribution to the 2020 targets. And I think it's important that we look into that as well. The G20 are really committed also to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, but then on the production side. And I think this is as important on the consumption side, but we only looked at the consumption side.
But I would ask about the markets versus policies for efficiency. Currently, according to the BP Statistical Review staff who I talked to about 10 days ago, U.S. automobile efficiency is increasing faster than CAFE standards. Indeed, the UNPRI reported that U.S. New car vehicle efficiency is up something like 18%, so 3.7% on the CAGR basis. So I'd like your comment on market-driven efficiency versus policy efficiency, and how come the market's beating policy?
Well, you know, in the United States, much more. No, in the United States, there is a tradition of market-driven innovation, and I think it's important to use that. In other parts of the world, it's policy-driven or regulation-driven. But I can imagine that when you have two things together at the same time, the right policies and the right market initiatives, then you have a real win-win situation. And I agree with what is happening with CAFE standards now. It's a nice target, but it would be much better if markets would innovate faster, because that gives you a competitive advantage, not within US, but United States versus the other ones. And I think that's what it's all about.
Well, then let's follow up that question on competitive advantage. In my 2009 article, I said U.S. oil consumption would decline at 1.5% per annum. It's declining at 1.6% per annum. So we're right on that track. Now, if you want 3% GDP growth, you have to have 4.6% efficiency growth year on year at that constant pace. Do you believe that U.S. oil consumption will continue to decline? And I could throw in the OECD if you want more broadly. And if so, do you believe that efficiency gains can be increased to 4.6% to meet a 3% growth target? Or are we now capped out at a lower rate of growth for the economy?
Well, there's another thing I would like to ask you. What time horizon?
Straight through 2030.
Okay. Well, it depends. It depends, of course, of what your administration is going to do, how your market is going to develop. But I think it's very, very, very ambitious.
Then would you agree with that oil prices are constraining the OECD and that potential growth is now constrained by the oil supply?
Well, what I mentioned before is, no, it's not constrained by the oil supply. It's not. Because as far as we know, and we monitor the market every month and we assess the market, we can see that the market is sufficiently well supplied. It's not about the amount of oil. That's not the point. When you're talking about the supply at this moment, there is about 500,000 barrels a day demand less. We have seen an increase in supply of 1 million barrels a day. So there's a gap, or there's an overflow of 1.5 million barrels a day. So the point is not the availability of oil. The point is the price. And then we come to the price and how to influence the price. Well, we can't influence the price. We can't. That's not up to the IEA. We are not a price-setting agency. We are not involved in the price-setting mechanism. But what we do know is that there's always volatility, as you know as well. There is always the anticipated risk. We always talk about futures. And this is something that is reflected in the price. We have seen prices this year soaring up to 150 barrels a day and then going down to $88 per barrel a day. So that shows already that volatility is there. And there was not a real connection with the market as well, because the market was efficiently supplied. It's even still, when there is a call on OPEC, the call on OPEC is answered. So the problem is in a different part of the world. It's not in the supplying part, it's in the financial part.
Well,
you don't need to agree with me.
But so your view is then that U.S. oil consumption will recover, or is it in secular decline?
Well, the point is it necessary for oil consumption to recover?
It's not necessary, okay. But if you want 3% GDP growth, then you have to have 3% GDP growth plus the rate of oil consumption decline to get that rate of growth, or else your rate of growth is capped as a matter of math.
But it's not only about oil. We're also talking about others. We are talking about gas. We are talking about coal. We are talking about renewables. And we are talking about the growth in domestic production in North America, not only in the United States, but in Canada as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you for a very interesting presentation. As you said, Russia is the major exporter to Europe of their oil and gas. And isn't it reasonable to assume that this is just going to increase now that Europe has outlawed fracking? And, you know, I'm not a Russian plant, and I don't know too much about the IEA, but why isn't Russia a part of your group? I mean, culturally, it's a European country, if not a European country. So, I mean, that is, I guess, you know, is what I'd like to ask then. Okay. Yeah.
Well, first about Russians' export to the EU. EU is not a growth market. EU is a market that is declining, as I told you before, as I mentioned before. But the growth of export from Russia is not to Europe, it's to the east, it's to China, it's to India. That's what they are thinking about. They are planning pipelines. They're also planning one additional pipeline to Europe. It's South Stream, and it will be kicked off next week on the 7th, and it will start from Anapa at the Black Sea. That's where it will start. It will not go to Baumgarten, that's Vienna. It will go to other parts of Europe, especially to former Yugoslavia, and from there on to Italy. As far as we expect, of course, it's not a decision. It's not our decision. It's Russian decision. Then about this outlaw on fracking, I wouldn't call it like that.
You what?
I wouldn't call it that, because there are differences in the viewpoints of the different countries. Germany, fracking, so shale gas, no. France, no. The Netherlands, don't think so. Poland, yes. Poland is very interested in shale gas and is working on it and would like to, and is going to develop its shale gas resources. But they have some problems to overcome. The shale gas, the resources are quite deep. The geological structure is not comparable with that of the United States, so they have to do a lot of extra survey. They have the problem of water and of electricity and of, well, here in the United States you have two very important assets. One asset, you have an industry to support this. The industry is not really there in Poland. And the second thing is you have quite different laws when it comes down to property. Here, when you own a property, you also own what's beneath it. Mm-hmm. In Europe, it's not the case. You own the land, and that's it. You don't own the resources. But as far as we expect, Poland, yes, they will go ahead with shale gas. Then about your third question, why isn't Russia a member of the IEA? Well, it's a very practical one. To be a member of the IEA, you need to be a member of the OECD. The IEA was founded in '74 as a reaction to the oil crisis in those days. It was an answer of the consuming countries, the major consuming countries at that moment, towards the producing countries. But of course, there are not the consuming countries have become producing countries as well. For instance, Canada and the United States, and we have seen other producing countries coming up, like Russia, big producer. Well, Russia is at this moment in the process of becoming a member of the OECD. And then, of course, the next question is, will they be interested in become a member of IEA? But I would like to answer your question also with some additional information. At this moment, as I mentioned to you, the OECD countries are just 1/3 of the global. They consume 1/3 of energy production. It's 1/3 of energy demand is connected to the OECD countries. The rest is in the others, is in the emerging countries. So if we really want to do something, if we really want to be serious about energy security, we have to engage the others. And that's Russia, China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Mexico, and Brazil. Others, yes, but these are the most important ones for the moment. So what we are working at is not to change the rules, because that is endless, but to find an answer, to engage them more in what we call an association, so that they are that they are part of our podium, that they are part of our discussions. And that's what we are working at this moment, and especially in Russia, China, also in India, there's very, very much interest to do that, because they realize, as well as OECD countries do, that it's a global, the energy world is global, and if you want energy security in your country, you need to be aware of what happens elsewhere. So when you have them engaged, it's shared knowledge, it's shared information, but it's also, hopefully, a shared approach on energy and emergency measurements. So what can you do? How can you prevent that when there is a problem you don't know how to do, and that you don't have enough stocks, for instance, things like that. So that's what we are working at.
And on Russia, we had recently a very interesting example of linkages with the creation of, through Rosneft, of the #1 oil company in the world, which in some extent is the reaction to the fact that Gazprom is losing power in natural gas, and also for the fact that Russia don't have the technology for exploiting oil in the Arctic. And so they needed to create new partnerships. And this, in my view, is a very interesting example of the interconnections of countries, the energy sources, and also companies.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I had a question. I was just wondering what impact you see, if any, of the carbon markets on the energy outlook. You know, it's always touted as a market-based solution to try to impact environmental issues. And you mentioned California. Last week they had their first auction on the cap and trade. You know, there's activity in Australia. There's a CDM that's floundering. And so I was just wondering if you see that being beneficial or just fluff, you know.
Well, of course, it's part of the answer. In Europe, we had an ETS. It started, and then in Europe, the idea was that there would be a price of around 30 euro per ton. But at this moment, the prices come down to 10 and even less euro.
Yes, yeah.
So then what we can see that it doesn't redirect investments anymore. In Australia, well, they are planning to have an ETS mechanism, but they are not really very clear about the definitions and about the rules that are going to be applied under the scheme. And unless these clarifications are made, it's very difficult to say anything about it. What they want to do is to link up with the European ETS. So that would mean that we have something across the world. Mm-hmm. There is a price, the ideas, the discussions of a price on carbon are in China as well, but China is very dependent on carbon, on coal. Mm-hmm. But they might do it, but then there is a reason for that. And the reason, well, if it's the climate, I'm not sure. But the reason also might be to promote the use of gas, and that we have a switch from coal to gas, and that not all your new power plants are using coal. So that would be part of the answer as well. But if your question also implies that we expect that there will be a global price on carbon, the answer is no.
No time in the future.
No. And as far as...
It
no,
might help, you know, with it's the same good, you know, it's cost $10 in California, $1 in the Northeast, you know,
yes.
1 or 2 euros in Europe.
But, and in the end, a global binding agreement on something like this would be extremely helpful. Mm-hmm. It would be extremely helpful because it, how shall I put it? It sees to it that we have the same kind of policies regarding carbon and coal everywhere in the world. And that would be beneficial to everybody, because then you have the competition at a different level and the different issues.
Hopefully more incentives.
Yes, and you get more incentives, but it doesn't help if the incentives are only in one country and not in the others. Doesn't really help.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for a very good presentation. I would like to ask you 2 questions, if I could. First of all, what do you see as the role of the IEA when you leave your tenure, or 4-year period? Especially given that you've stated that your current mission is to engage emerging countries.
Yes.
And you've mentioned you have a 4-pronged policy instrument that you wanted to engage them in. Could you elaborate on that? Secondly, the chief economist of the IEA, Fatih Birol, recently said in an interview that he was disappointed and he thought that it was a colossal mistake by the European countries to dogmatically shut down development in unconventional gas. I would like to hear what your thoughts are on that. Do you agree with him?
Of course.
And what are your thoughts in general on unconventional gas? Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, starting with your last question, of course I agree with him. Because, you know, it's very important whenever that you are messaging something from an agency, please message the same message. Otherwise it doesn't work. But we are concerned about gas, and we are very concerned about unconventional gas. Because unconventional gas there are some, risk is not the right word, but there are concerns. And the concerns are about water use. The concerns are about environmental footprint. The concerns are about land use. The concerns are about fracking gels, etc. So that's exactly the reason why we published this year in June a book, and it was called The Golden Rules for the Golden Age of Gas. And because if you don't respect a number of rules, and if they are not put in regulatory frameworks, then you are not going to meet the public concerns. And if you're not meeting public concerns, then there will be public resistance. And public resistance is awfully strong, awfully strong. And I think it's absolutely necessary to take into account these public concerns and do something about it. And I know that here in the United States, things are different. You know, I've been to Eagle Ford, and there you can see how huge it is, how few people there live. But that's not the same in other parts of the world. So you have to take into account these things. But I also have seen in Texas and in Louisiana the differences in water use. And that in Texas they are now having a number of projects to reuse the water, so clean it after the fracking process and reuse it so that you can reuse it again. This is not done in Louisiana. So things have to be regulated some way or the other. Otherwise, we think that the unconventional gas will stay where it is, down under. Well, okay. If you want to keep it there, okay, that's up to you. But if you want to get it out, please see to it that you do it in a responsible way, in a way that is not harming your climate. Because, of course, there are issues also about that.
Would you still agree with him that it's a colossal mistake by your politicians, your colleagues in Europe to shut it down? Or
well, it's a mistake not to talk about it.
Okay.
That's a mistake. That's a real mistake, because then you shut your eyes and you say, okay, I don't see it, it's not there. That's not useful. That's not useful, because the world changes around you. And I think that's exactly what happens in Poland, where they know the world is changing around them and where they are looking around for possibilities to explore the shale gas. But if you just say no, and that's it, without arguments, without arguing with your population, I think it's part of your job as a politician. And I was a politician part of my life, and I know how difficult it is. And I was before groups, well, they were much bigger than this, and they were just saying no. But it was not to shale gas, it was to windmills. So it was renewables. But the most important thing is that's the job you have as a politician. You have to be aware of what you are doing now has its consequences for more than 20, 30, 40 years, especially when it comes to energy infrastructure. And that means that you have to think about it, you have to explore it, and then take a decision, yes or no. Then your first question about the role of IEA and what I would like to see when I leave this job in 2015, then I would like to see that the countries I just mentioned are part of an association where IEA is part of as well, and that we discuss these things together. That we also are discussing together issues about emergency releases, emergency stocks, about emergency measures, emergency responses, that we know that we share our data, that we share our knowledge, that we make a choice on, hopefully, well, not we, but the governments make a choice on technologies like CCS. And of course it costs a lot of money, but it brings also a lot of benefits. I hope to achieve this. And I think that it was not mentioned before, but I really think that technology is can offer part of the questions, part of the answers to the questions we at this moment have. we had another quite interesting publication. It was Energy Technology Perspectives, in which we showed that many technologies, most technologies that we could use are already there. And some of them are already economically viable as well. Not everywhere in the world. Solar and wind is not viable everywhere, but in many parts of the world it is. But we don't make the decisions to use it as much as we can. And I hope that also in that respect there will be some changes.
Thank you very much.
And if you don't achieve it in 2015, you stay until 2019.
No, I don't
Okay.
think so, because by then I'm 20, by then I'll be 66, and then it's enough. And then hopefully there will be others, and I hope also that some of your students will join IEA afterwards, because, you know, it's really fantastic to work there.
Just a quick question. Do you think that OPEC could oversupply the market next year, particularly in light of growing, North American production and, other non-OPEC countries that are, boosting oil production?
Well, of course, they will have their meeting in December, and then they'll decide what they are going to do. Our outlook for 2013 is around the same as OPEC's is. So that there is less demand, a little bit less demand than there is now. But of course, they have to decide themselves, and they have to decide on something else as well. You know, they have a ceiling, a production ceiling, as OPEC countries together. And if Iraq is really going to produce as much as we expect it will produce, they have to discuss two things. It's about the ceiling. Are they going to make the ceiling higher? And they have to discuss the quota. And that will be, I think, a very interesting discussion to follow. Because if they don't allow Iraq to produce, well, then there will be tensions within OPEC itself. But I think they will come up with some new comments on that I hope in December. And then I can answer your question.
So you think they'll raise the quota and allow Iraq to pump?
I don't know. I really don't know. Because in OPEC although it's an organization of like-minded production countries, they are not the same, and they are not all of them are real friends to one another.
Thank you.
Can we leave a last question to my former Chinese student, Xiaojing? She was very important in the way that her behavior in classes really stimulated a lot of interest about China and energy. You're not expecting, now she's a consultant in a year. Congratulations. Xiaojing, would you mind to raise a question about China? She's not expecting this.
I do have a question on your view on China's natural gas, the demand for natural gas in terms of, importing more gas from Central Asia or from Russia, or what's your view on that? What you think is more likely to happen?
Well, at this moment,
they're going to just import more LNG.
Well, at this moment, I think they'll import more LNG. They're having discussions with Russia about a new pipeline.
Yeah.
But the third thing is that they are exploring their own shale gas resources. And there are some resources, but they are in quite remote places where there is no infrastructure and where there's no water, no electricity, and the gas is needed somewhere else. So there are quite some answers to be given to questions. We worked together with Chinese government and with NDRC on the regulation issue for shale gas, and we made a survey of 4 countries on gas in general, not on shale gas, but gas in general. We compared the regulations for them and compared it with the Chinese situation. Well, now it's up to them what kind of use they are going to make out of that to explore their own gas resources. But shale gas resources they do have. We expect them to explore it and to exploit it, but well, if it will be before 2020 is a question mark.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was an honor. It was a fantastic event. And we really hope that next year you would have to come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.